easy to play. So I appreciate the work that is put in to pick out those songs for us this morning. That is the title for today. Are words adequate to reflect the realities that we live in? And as I read that, and I read it again yesterday, I thought my mom would be cringing because it should say the realities within which we live. And has that rule changed that you're not supposed to end a sentence with it? Oh.
And preposition is the wrong thing to end a sentence with.
But can't with be a preposition? Yeah, okay, all right. So my mom can rest easy that now I'm speaking grammatically correctly now. Okay, all right, okay. Okay, all right, okay. All right, I'm over that one. All right. So okay, moving right along. Why don't you go ahead and put on the first slide there, Davey? So I'm wondering if anybody knows who said this statement. The opposite of a correct statement is a false statement, but the opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth. A great truth is a truth whose opposite is also a great truth. Does anybody know? I thought somebody would know this one. This is this is physicist Niels Bohr. Okay, let that sink in. We're thinking opposites today. And what is a truth and what is well, okay. Go ahead and put on the next one. All right, how about this one? The test of I heard this on NPR, by the way. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. That's profound enough as it is, but then the author added this piece of context. One should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless, yet be determined to make them otherwise. Does that ring a bell with anybody? It's an author, but not T.S. Eliot.
F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. Whoever said that out of the correct. Thank you. Okay. Yes, it's F. Scott Fitzgerald. Yeah. Well, but I'm not arguing about his literary works. I'm presenting that statement because it's a wonderful statement. All right. Okay. So the next slide, please. The third one. One more. If it's not in your language, it's not in your mind. I'm not asking if you agree with it. I'm asking if you know who said it. Okay, yeah, it is. I was hoping that one of you would know who said this. I say it a lot, but I take no credit for it, obviously. I just know it's one of the more profound statements I've ever heard, and it reveals a number of things, positive and negative, if you want to look at it like that. So we'll keep thinking about who said that. Go ahead and take them off there. And I'll give you an example of how that makes sense if it's not in your language, it's not in your mind, and add to that how life can be less meaningful when we assume there is only one way to understand what we make of our own realities. In the Lakota language, there is no word for goodbye. Instead, Lakota speakers express farewells in a variety of ways, a common phrase being Toxa Aske, which means later, like see you later, or again, see you again. There's a different nuance there. So what does it mean that a language that reflects the reality for an entire people has no word for goodbye? Part of what it means is that we are always together. When many indigenous people worship, they always acknowledge that they are in the presence of their ancestors, presence of those who are not with us physically, but also part of that is not physically present because they are on a different journey. They have passed on. I'm also reminded of the Jewish custom of setting an extra plate at a table for the prophet Elijah. And I'm reminded of Christians who say the Apostles' Creed. Within the Apostles' Creed, I believe in the communion of saints. It's a good and timely thing to remember in this season that is close to All Saints' Day, those who have gone before us. In our understanding, and I mean our, I guess loosely, but generally speaking, most of our Western society and our culture, in our understanding, the word goodbye implies that we are not together anymore when we're not in the same room or in the same Zoom conversation, even when we are not in each other's physical presence. Otherwise, we are separate. So we say goodbye. Our language reveals a great deal about the way we think and thus how we experience our lives. Now, it's not a bad thing to have or to use the word goodbye, but if there's maybe one thing that we need today, it's to learn a new way to think about a lot of things. In most indigenous language, there's no word for religion either, which is really interesting because one can't separate religion from everyday life. Everything is sacred all the time. We are always in the presence of the sacred, as we are always in each other's presence, and each other also includes all creation. Which is why, at least in English translations of indigenous languages, you hear something that is in indigenous language because it's in their minds when animals, for example, are referred to as people. Besides the two-legged people, there are four-legged people, there are winged people, there are people that crawl, or that slither along the ground. And that is not necessarily to elevate non-humans to the importance that we think of ourselves as being two-legged creatures, but the equal ground upon which we stand is for all creation. And their language then reflects that in ways that ours doesn't necessarily do. So going further, world religion scholar Houston Smith wrote that to indigenous people, there is often no distinction between good and evil, because all power is seen as one, and the distinction arises then as how it is used. The same person calling on the same power could work evil or good according to their desire. The opposite then is also true. If it is in your language, it is in your mind. And here's an interesting statement by Nelson Mandela. If you talk to a person in a language they understand, that goes to their head. If you talk to them in their own language, that goes to their heart. And I believe he was referring specifically to using someone's native language, because by speaking their language, you honor them in their way of understanding. You recognize them as an individual expressed through a language that says a great deal. Because language is filled with nuance that comes from culture, it comes from experience, it comes from geography, it comes from history, it comes from relationship. But I also believe that Nelson Mandela was saying that we understand in different ways. We understand from our heads and we understand from our hearts, which can be two very different ways of communicating and experiencing and knowing things. It's also interesting in original Buddhist texts that were written in the Pali language, P-A-L-I, in that language, and thus in their understanding, the word heart and mind are the same word. Heart, mind, the same. Interestingly, so is the word meaning anger and fear. It's the same word, experienced differently, perhaps. We understand from our heads and our hearts. But the split that we know in the West is not necessarily even recognized in the East, or oftentimes in indigenous cultures in the West. Our languages and minds know and think differently and in very deeply significant ways. So, in the Unitarian Universalist Holidays, Holy Days, and worship themes, 2002 and 2003, 2022 and 2023, November 20th is Transgender Day of Remembrance, a day to memorialize those who have been murdered as a result of transphobia. So think back now to my opening statements about the opposite of a profound truth being another profound truth in the context of Transgender Day of Remembrance, and think of the phrase intelligence being the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function, whether that's what Fitzgerald was thinking about or not. It doesn't matter. He probably wasn't. One of the things that makes life hard for many today is the dominance of language that reflects a binary understanding and practice. And I would add prejudice. Within the limitations presented in a binary understanding of the world, some might say that we are not functioning very well. Now, some might suggest that through a binary lens, that transgender equates to neither of its inherent identities that we have come to consider as opposites: male, female. Perhaps looking through a different understanding, a different lens, perhaps male and female are not opposites after all, but exist on a continuum. Perhaps what we understand as opposing poles are not really opposites at all, but components of each other. So please put on the next slide, Davey. The yin and the yang, found within Taoism, can be a very helpful paradigm. You will hear both nuances in this definition. Yin and yang is a Chinese philosophical concept that describes opposite yet interconnected forces. Yin and yang represent duality, or the idea that two opposite characteristics can actually exist in harmony and complement each other. As you see, one is found always within the other. So they are not exclusive of each other, but they are inclusive of each other. One power or force or reality is found within the other. Unity and diversity are necessary components of and within each other. Thank you. So we live today in what I would like to say, in a perceived binary world, in which we tend to believe that there is only one truth or one way of understanding something. We see opposites. So I'm going to try this on you. I'll say one pole and you add the opposite. So if I say light, you might say dark. Okay, well, you got it right away. First try. If I say left, you might say. If I say right, you might say wrong. I was going for a different nuance there. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. You got it. If I say good, you might say bad or evil. Yep. If I say black, if I say up, if I say in, if I say true, Okay, you got it. If I say positive, if I say Republican, you say Democrat, probably. If I say liberal, you might say conservative. If I say male, I say female. If I say she, okay, all right. It's a language thing, right? Correct, I should say. It's a cultural thing, correct? It's a perception thing, correct? It's how we or many view and thus create the reality in which we live. And I would like to say, is that correct also? Is there another way? Might there be another reality for us to live within? The last month, the you theme from Soul Matters was belonging. How can one belong in a world or to a society in which they don't fit because there is no room for them in our language and thus in our mind? How many times have you heard someone say they've been aware that they are different or were aware of their own identity or reality, but had no words to express it? I cringe when I think back to the words that my parents used to describe people who had a gender identity different than how we thought of ourselves within our immediate family. We had no words for them, and they were not, and the words that we did have words for them, excuse me, and they were not words of acceptance. When we acknowledged their presence, it was negative because there was something we compared it to that was in our minds positive. Thus, they were negative. It was bad compared to what was good. It was moral because, well, and sometimes we just didn't know what to say. Well, it just isn't right, you know. I remember my dad saying, well, it's not moral, thus meaning it is immoral, based on what we had learned at that time or thought was true at that time. Gender identity has always been fluid, but our language and our stories reveal how accepting or non-accepting we are religiously, culturally, and morally, and societally, all those categories. That we even have a Transgender Day of Remembrance is a terribly sad reality. That we have any days of remembrance for those who have been murdered or killed in a war is part of a reality that we have created and of which we need to be reminded as we struggle with who we both want not to be and who we want to be. We can understand there is no separation. Think back to what I said about how we envision, how we imagine those who are not here with us. We can understand that there's no separation between us. We can also begin to understand that there's no separation within us, within our bodies, within our spirits or our souls. Our language and our mind and heart can give us hope that one day we will not live in a world full of binaries because our minds and our languages reflect new realities that we are accepting. What Taoism expresses as the way of all things. Now, it is still true, sadly, that sadly and honestly, sometimes I wonder, in many ways, it's not sad, but it is still true that what is in some minds is not in others. I mean, it's nice to have a variety of a lot of things, but in some cases, it is still true and sad that what is in some minds is not in others. But that's also when hope and hard work are vital to us as a community. I am grateful and to be part of a national church, the ELCA, that is opening and welcoming. And I'm grateful to be here, able to say these words to another fellowship of like-minded and like-hearted people. I'm glad to be here on this National Day of Remembrance of transgender people. And I'll close with words from someone who is new on my radar. Her name is Lyra Boroditsky, or Boroditsky. I'm not sure how you'd pronounce it. She was born in 1976. Lyra is a cognitive scientist and professor in the fields of language and cognition. And her bio says this: Boroditsky was born in Belarus to a Jewish family. When she was 12 years old, her family emigrated to the United States, where she learned to speak English as her fourth language. As a teenager, she began thinking about the degree to which language differences could shape an argument and exaggerate the differences between people. Now, it also went on to say that she studies language and cognition, focusing on interactions between language, cognition, and perception. And her work has provided new insights into the controversial question of whether the languages we speak shape the way we think. It's called linguistic relativity. So please put on the final slide. What's in our language is in our mind. What's not in our language is not in our mind. I stand here and hope today that our language can change and our minds can change, because our hearts also can change. So again, from Niels Bohr, a great truth is a truth who is opposite, if you want to see it that way, is also a great truth. And from Scott Fitzgerald, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Come on, people, we can do that. And from language and cognition scientist and professor Lyra Boroditsky, the beauty of linguistic diversity is that it reveals to us just how ingenious and how flexible the human mind is, and I would add to that, the human heart. So what's on your mind? What's on your heart today? Thank you.